But the very notion that the people in a democratic system can tell you what they want and that you can just say, no, we're either not going to do that or we can't do that was like, this was right. And I think we talked about this notion that we live in a representative democracy. For a lot of people, already they feel like, wow, that's not true. They don't listen to
Yeah.
me. Like, voter turnout numbers are so low. There's lots of ways we can gauge that. But this proves to folks in a different kind of way that even when we get together and tell them what we asked for, and they're not willing to give it to us. So what are we then left with, right? And for us, that really came down to we got to make them give us what we want and need.
Yeah.
And it pushed us then towards thinking about power building. And I just want to draw the connection here. Us doing that is incredibly unharmonious, right? If anything, it's downright taking a position of being antagonistic at times towards systems. Not to say that we want to tear all of them down and none of them work or anything, but like this antagonism is rooted in a deep love, a deep desire for them to function in different ways. But the end product here is very contentious.
This is Social Justice Origin Stories. I'm your host, Relando Tompkins Jones. Social Justice Origin Stories is a storytelling project that highlights personal stories and defining moments that have inspired individuals and organizations to labor for equity and social justice. Through truth-telling, the honest sharing of their experiences, storytellers teach us about themselves, enabling us to learn about ourselves and our world through their stories. By reconnecting with pivotal moments of activation in their lives, they invite us to do the same. At Social Justice Origin Stories, we believe that there's power in storytelling and lived experience is experience. There's room enough for all of us to do this work. There are many ways to contribute, and our contributions don't need to be the same. We can enter and remain engaged in the work using the gifts that are special to us while supporting others and using theirs. We have the capacity to grow and change for the better when exposed to new information and experiences. We believe in our inherent worth and capabilities, and we possess the power to inspire and create change within ourselves and others. We can transcend the confines of the status quo to imagine and design more equitable and humanizing systems. So thank you for joining us today. Today, we are joined by Kyle Lim. Welcome, and thank you so much for spending some of your time today to share with us about your social justice origin stories as it connects to not only your work with the Urban Core Collective's education justice work, but also a little bit about your own social justice origin story. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your story with us. As folks will know by the time this recording comes out, some of the storytelling I have about the project, it was even asking people to come on and share their stories was an exercise of me looking back over the course of my life over folks who have inspired me, who have poured into me, who I care for, who care for me and supported me in different ways. And so it means it means so much that you're here to share.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Rolando. Really glad to be on here. As you mentioned, my name's Kyle Lim. I'm originally from Singapore. I moved to the US as an adult. So I went to school here, but I was already 20 at the time. I'm a passionate racial justice advocate, community organizer, a father also. That takes up a lot of my time and energy. I've been living in the Grand Rapids area and doing work here for just about 15 years, long enough to get a lay of the land a little bit and really focusing on racial justice work and the duration of that time. So really glad to be on here and glad for this project and excited for the conversation.
Thank you so much. So one of the quotes I've been using to get conversations started here is a quote from Corey Bush that says, "Many of us do not choose to become activists. We are activated." And before you start talking about your work with the Urban Core Collective, what were some of the things that activated you?
I'm originally from Singapore, born and raised, biracial family. I look white. My dad's Chinese. My mom is Canadian, Dutch Canadian. I grew up in a society that had just really different understandings of race. And we're a post-colonial country, Singapore. We very much adopted normative racial categories. So you had to fit in. You're either Chinese or Indian or Malay, or there wasn't even a there was a category for others, right? There wasn't a space biracial folks or the like. I spent a lot of my life trying to be as Chinese as possible because that's how I was identified, right? The race of your father. On my little ID card, it says race Chinese, and people would look at me and be like, "What? Who are you?" So I have a lot of personal history of trying to fit into the messy categories that exist. And that really followed me to the US, where suddenly I was living here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, attending a predominantly white college for the first time. Around, I was a part of a majority, at least in terms of how I looked. And I was socialized as such, even though much of my, as I mentioned, previous sort of racial and cultural identity had been trying to really separate myself from my whiteness and to try to be as Chinese as possible. So there's this really flip flopping dynamic as I came here that primed me, I think, in some ways for a sensitivity around how race looks and feels and really the function of it here in the US. I went to a school named Calvin University. If you're familiar with it, this is where Betsy DeVos comes from, and it's sort of known as this bastion of conservative Christianity. So you might be like, well, how did you turn into a radical racial justice organizer? It was really because of that, right? So I think some of those incongruities that I noticed early on became really apparent to me in terms of expectation socially that everybody followed a normative way of thinking about things or had a certain kind of background set of knowledge or beliefs that I didn't share, but was left behind the scenes of a little bit, or the curtain was pulled back a little bit with my ability to pass. While I was at Calvin, I moved off campus pretty early on for some of those reasons. I didn't really get along with a lot of the people that went to school there. And I moved to a neighborhood here in Grand Rapids called Baxter neighborhood. It's a predominantly Black neighborhood, although that's changing very quickly with gentrification. And from my house, I used to walk to the corner store, Miss Tracy's, to buy my cigarettes. And then I would ride my bike down this street called Franklin at the time. Now it's called Martin Luther King, and through a suburb called East Grand Rapids. This was to get to college. And East Grand Rapids is a very wealthy, predominantly white suburb of the Grand Rapids area. So I was going through these like world changes within 15 minutes on my bike, where there was this pretty poor, predominantly renters, predominantly Black community, and then going through these areas of extreme affluence where you really didn't see any Black folks around. And so just from a social landscape perspective, this became really interesting to me. And so I decided to do some research at the time on an intersection here in Grand Rapids, Wealthy and Fuller, which at the time was anchored by a newly opened bank, Sandman, which is a barbecue spot. There was an empty lot on the corner and another burger joint on the other corner. The empty lot used to be a club, the White Rabbit, that was torn down. And that corridor used to be, again, this hub of Black business that really came into being after white flight in Grand Rapids. So white businesses moved further north. This became a pretty thriving Black business district. And then in the 90s, connected to the beginnings really of folks moving back to the cities, as we began to experience gentrification that was driving a lot of Black folks out. I decided in one of my classes to study this neighborhood, was interviewing residents about their experiences and stuff like that. And that really, really opened my eyes, I think, to some of the really systemic ways that race was built into our systems here, right? Particularly, I think, our public systems. So after I graduated, I was trying to figure out what to do with this passion around racial justice. I ended up working for a nonprofit that very much endorsed this notion of racial reconciliation, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later, because it's a very certain sort of orientation towards the work of racial justice, which I think we need to be really careful of. And worked in that nonprofit space for a while, getting really frustrated with really what they were framing as the end goals, right? These notions of racial harmony and togetherness and stuff like that without really the justice orientation piece of it, right? This sense of, yeah, it'd be nice if we could get along, but in order to do that, we need some things,
Yes.
right? And so that was really my frustration with the organization, which I've now come to learn is also a symptom of some of the systems that we live in, the way that they're set up to, if we think of the nonprofit system, certain folks are funded to do certain kinds of work that is often not have this kind of transformative, redistributive effect on systems and on power structures, particularly. And so, yeah, I had this experience in nonprofits of frustration work around our vision of what racial justice was really meaning for folks. I went back to school thinking like, maybe I'll learn my way out of this, which did helped me a little bit in terms of expanding my imagination. But then really coming back to Grand Rapids after going back to school, realizing like, what we really need to be doing is building, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, beginning to build some power in this space to get at that kind of transformative, redistributive aspect of racial justice that I felt was missing from the local conversation here in Grand Rapids and the local set of practice that was
Hmm.
happening here in Grand Rapids. And my expertise and experience was cited within schools and education. So it became a really easy space for me to imagine how do we build out something around education justice that contains these elements in our work, and was blessed to be able to do that cited within the Urban Core Collective, which I'm happy to talk a little bit about that too.
You mentioned this idea of racial harmony. It would be really nice
Yeah.
for us to all get along, but here are some
Yeah,
things that we need. And what I got from it, there's a dynamic there that needs to be named and we need to be careful of. One of the things that came to my mind, particularly when you said harmony, is just like these experiences like harmony at what or at whose expense? Because sometimes
that's right.
that harmony that folks are asking for is really, can we just pretend that your concerns, your needs here are somehow being met when they actually aren't? For our comfort, harmony is in don't rock the
Yes.
boat, like harmony. So could you say a little bit
Yes.
more about that? Particularly, I appreciate how you shared, and that's something that we need to be careful of in our movements.
Yeah, I do want to give dividends where it's due. Lee Patel in 2017 wrote a really great article called The Origins, Potentials, and Limitations of Racial Justice. If you're able to get on and pull that article, highly recommend it. But in that article, they outline a few pitfalls, which I'll map over my own personal experience. One of them is that really the origins of what we know of as anti-racism and the sort of the teaching behind that specifically was really geared towards white folks. And it was a consciousness raising exercise for them, right? Because the idea was, and you can find this in W.E. Du Bois, right? Like people of color, Black folks specifically had this notion of double consciousness. They were already aware, right? So the education aspect really comes out of this idea of second wave feminism, consciousness raising, right? A way for us to educate the people. And by the people here, we're talking about white folk, about what's going on with racial justice. So a really good example of that is the white privilege walk, right? Where if you've done it before in an anti-racism training, everybody kind of starts at the same starting place, a series of questions from Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege Knapsack is read, right? And they go like this. If your parents had access to higher education, take a step forward. If you've ever had to worry about food for the next day, take a step forward, right? Or if you've never had to worry. So that the goal is to show sort of the distance, the privilege distance that exists, or gap, if you will, between white folks and people of color. The affective experience of that, if you've ever been a person of color in that space, is to feel like I'm like down in the dumps here. It's a really kind of defeatist experience. I'm biracial and I was stuck in the middle. I'm like, I'm not up there with those folks. I'm not back here with these folks. Like, it's a
Yeah.
really disorienting kind of experience. And that really the pedagogical aim of it is to create some dissonance for white folks, right? To make them realize the distance that exists between where they're situated and where people of color are. But that also create the unexplored assumption that the goal for us then is togetherness, right? There's this built-in assumption, right? Particularly around the pedagogical aims of an activity like that, which is very common in anti-racism curriculum, to say individual sort of guilt, right? Sort of learning is really one of the key goals of anti-racism, right? That we need to understand better. And we hear that a lot in our narratives, be on the right side of history. It's this idea of learning and elevating your thinking to be anti-racist, right? And even becomes a label sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. But we don't really, in those things, often talk about redistributions of power, right? Some of the like economic systems that create this, like the very kind of logical designs of race in the first place in terms of consolidation of both economic, political, and social power, right? Like we don't talk about that oftentimes in these instances. Rather, the goal is to prime our understanding around how we can be anti-racist. So that's, I think, one of the big pitfalls, or two of them perhaps, is that the emphasis is on individual learning and understanding and not on social transformation. And that the end goal in mind has to be this kind of harmonious relationship and not structures that promote justice and equality and fairness and those kind of ways, right? So social transformation. So I think that's like some of the dangers that I talk about when I think about, and this isn't just true to, I think, folks that really embrace the anti-racism pedagogy, but it's also about this idea of learning our way out of things, right? And we're not going to understand our way out of racism. We're not going to allow for that. And so it really is going to require. So when you hear people talking about revolution and stuff like that, like these are not empty ideas, right? It actually requires a transformation of our social systems in order for us to achieve this thing. And that their personal relations are going to figure themselves out as a result, in my mind, right? We can't lead. I don't like everybody. And I don't want to get along with everybody. But the idea that we can have space for those kind of differences and respect and power to be
Yeah.
able to truly negotiate our position, like that's different now, right? It doesn't necessitate harmony necessarily. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we can't learn ourselves out of it. These sorts of exercises are often done with the assumption that harmony is the end goal for everyone involved. Also, I appreciate you speaking to the impact, because the impact of that learning isn't distributed equally either. Even as you were
That's
describing your
right.
own experience, I've often heard that too. Feedback, folks of color. Wait a minute. Okay, y'all over here, y'all might have learned some things, but I'm feeling horrible over here. Where's my benefit off of this? What are my ways of getting something out of things that, in a way, I'm being reminded of things that I already knew about my condition.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you sharing
Can I just
that.
pull from there, Relando?
Yeah,
Because
go
I
for it, go
think
for it.
that this is exactly it. It's designed for white folks to learn something at somebody else's expense. And this isn't the first time that our racial justice projects have picked this up. I mentioned to you in the pre-conversation, I want
Yeah.
to blow up Brown versus Board versus Ed for a little bit, right? Board of Ed, Brown versus Board of Ed, right? In that idea, the case that was made for integration was on the ill effects of segregation for Black folks. So if you think about what was brought up as the most compelling evidence in the trial, Brown versus Board of Ed, was the Kenneth Clark doll test. Watched it. There's some great videos around it. Basically, they asked Black kids which baby dolls are good and which baby dolls are bad. And that most often the Black kids were saying the white baby dolls were good and the Black baby dolls were bad. And they used this, right? Black kids' awareness of social hierarchy, their educational awareness, to make the case that Black kids were harmed, that they thought lesser of themselves because of segregation, and that integration then became the way to help solve this issue, right?
Mhm.
There was no mention of disparate resources, which was really the the vision of a lot of Black folks that were pushing for education reform, was like, no, we like our schools. Our kids are learning great, but we actually need a school building. We need some money to pay our teachers, right? It was this cry for resources, and it got turned into this way for really where white folks retain the power of integration for white folks to help Black folks, right? So it became, again, this pedagogical impetus of, oh, we got to feel bad and then we need to do the right thing. The project that we've inherited has a long history here. And it's even come to the point where not only does it inform our anti-racist pedagogy or the way in which we teach folks to understand race in our country, but it's infected our public policy too. Now, this idea of multiculturalism and empathy building and all of this kind of stuff is so rife in schools when we're seeing these huge material inequities continue to plague them, right? So I draw that through line to say this caution, I think, is important for us to reckon with in our own individual origin stories, our own journeys, and our visions for the political project we want to be involved in. But it's also really something where we have to challenge and undo the legacy of in a lot of our systems as well.
Are we internalizing negativity, or do we just understand the power structures as it's designed? And
Yeah.
is that understanding being seen as, oh, wait, and then for what end? Again, for what end does it serve? Okay. So as you
Yeah.
shared, we got to feel
Why
bad
did
about it.
not be? Yeah, this could be a symptom of your double consciousness. If we had taken it from a Du Boisian perspective, right? It's, oh, Black kids do that. They understand the system as an asset framing versus the way it got internalized because of a lot of that. And there's political reasons why that makes sense at the time of World War II or just post World War II. The US is trying to reconstitute itself as, right, post civil rights era as this progressive white-led nation, right? Anti-racism became appealing. So there's lots of reasons, but we need to understand those things as we think about our social justice origin stories, right? That these stories come out of histories and they push us towards destinations that we have to be really conscious of as we go about doing our work. And it requires, I think, a willingness for our politics and our analysis to change and shift over time. And yeah, I leave it at that for now.
You described some of your own earlier experiences and how they have shaped even your analysis as it is now. How do you carry that with you into the Urban Core Collective's education justice work? Could you talk a little bit about even the origin story of that aspect of the work
Yeah,
and how you're carrying some of the storytelling you're sharing into the work that you're doing?
sure. I, I think it's important first to say that like the work of the UCC's or Urban Core Collective's education justice um, work is not my story alone. That there's lots of people involved here.
That's right.
But I am going to kind of map my personal experience onto how this has come into being because I do think that our ed justice work seeks to be representative of a lot of people's experiences, right? And to account for those. So I had been working at a local nonprofit here in Grand Rapids in education for a while, doing advocacy work. So when I talk about that, like going to decision makers on behalf of somebody else and asking them for a different outcome. And it was case by case student led advocacy. Predominantly Black students would call a hotline if they are having issues with a suspension or with their special ed IEP, individualized education plan or something like that. And we had advocates that we would deploy to these meetings to help essentially advocate on behalf of the families and the students. So I was doing this kind of work. It was really rewarding in the sense that I got to know a lot of people's families. It was really frustrating in the sense that we very rarely achieved the outcomes that we desired within systems that were not designed to support students and families in the ways that we were hoping for. That became a big source of frustration for me as I did this work was like, students and parents need this, but we're not actually changing anything. It felt like harm reduction work, right? We're trying to remove these systems, but without actually changing the systems themselves, which is a big part of the harm reduction theory of change, right? That experience was really frustrating for me. So, and I knew that I was coming back from school. The sense that I had was like, we need to do something that's going to address the system. And my experience in the organizational landscape of Grand Rapids around education specifically was that most folks were not building power to change the system. They were doing similar work what we were doing, like harm reduction within the system. That could look like tutoring, right? That could look like sort of services. Or they were maybe doing high level advocacy work, which I say is like pushing specific policies or things like that, that they thought would have a net trickle down effect. But what was absent was true sort of community based power building that's rooted in a few things. One, it's rooted in a sense of self-determination that many people actually have really good ideas of what they want public systems to look like and feel like and do, including education systems. Right. And that was when we went in and asked people, it was really not, it was sort of like we call them now the essentials of healthy and healing school. Kids can get to school on time. They have teachers in their classrooms, right? The schools themselves are clean and safe from like an air quality perspective. We just gotten off of COVID at the time. The food that they were eating was appetizing and healthy and culturally responsive, fit a very diverse student body. And last but not least, that there was mental health supports in place for schools as they navigate adolescence, right? Who would have thought that adolescence is a time when we need some well-placed adults to help us navigate all the changes that are happening in our bodies, right? These 5 things, essentials of a healthy and healing school, is like people were really clear on what they wanted. But why was that? The school system set up to be able to provide that in the way that we wanted to. And when we just asked for it, we were met with all kinds of excuses and refusals from the system. And I don't want to broadly paint all the actors within our public systems as bad actors that people exist within. But the very notion that the people in a democratic system can tell you what they want and that you can just say, no, we're either not going to do that or we can't do that was like, this was right. And I think we talked about this notion that we live in a representative democracy. For a lot of people, already they feel like, wow, that's not true. They don't listen to me. Like, voter turnout numbers are so low. There's lots of ways we can gauge that. But this proves to folks in a different kind of way that even when we get together and tell them what we asked for, and they're not willing to give it to us. So what are we then left with, right? And for us, that really came down to we got to make them give us what we want and need.
Yeah.
And it pushed us then towards thinking about power building. And I just want to draw the connection here. Us doing that is incredibly unharmonious, right? If anything, it's downright taking a position of being antagonistic at times towards systems. Not to say that we want to tear all of them down and none of them work or anything, but like this antagonism is rooted in a deep love, a deep desire for them to function in different ways. But the end product here is very contentious. It's not this peace, love, work, vision of multicultural society kind of thing.
Yeah. Going back to some of your earlier points. Yeah. It's not this neat and clean. Yeah. Everybody is not aligned on what the end should be.
So we're pushing right now, right? We decided, okay, we need to go and build community power. So we started community organizing with students, with parents, with building level staff, right? To say like, this is what y'all want, but we're not getting that. How do we force them to give us what we want, even when they don't want to? And that's really been the mantra that we've been using is these things are basic rights. Education is a basic right for us. This is a guaranteed thing by our government, but it's not functioning the way that we need it to. And our systems of asking it to feel broken. We talked about earlier this idea, representative democracy in a lot of ways is already a fallacy.
Yes.
We can elect school board members, but then we're in this condition now where it's like, okay, we have elected school board members, but an appointed governance body, right? And a superintendent. And uh, um, school board members have quite little power in comparison with a superintendent, or in the case of city government here in Grand Rapids, a city manager, right? Your city council versus your city manager. And so already there's lots of ways in which our power has been diffused, even within the context of our elected democracy. And so our really thing was like, how do we bring our power back? And that requires the work of building power. And I think that's the journey that we're on right now, is like, how do we continue to build power rooted in our values? And, UCC is a racial justice organization. So really prioritizing who we're building power with and for, but also prioritizing and uplifting the wisdom that those communities have in terms of what we want the thing to look like, right? And being able to root our energy and work in their desires, and do the work of fleshing out what those desires, right? Because different people have different ideas about stuff. A lot of our work is around like taking the time to do sense making around stuff as a group, and generating buy-in, or being willing to say, you know what, I don't see it yet, but maybe my thing can come later,
Yeah.
give us what we want, even when they don't want to. Um, and doing that by really honoring the experiences that people have, the desires that they have for their selves and their families, in the case of schools, particularly for their kids, and moving forward from a value orientation that says, yeah, everybody here matters, and everybody's voice is important.
And I know you can speak to that more than I can, but I've seen in different ways, hey, you all getting the word out. Hey, this meeting is coming up. This policy is coming up.
That's right.
Here's what it is. Let's share with you. Here's what's on the thing. Give us feedback. What are some of how are you feeling about this? Is this what you actually want? And taking that information and bringing it to the folks when those decisions are made. Just as you're describing these things, I'm just thinking in the different ways that I've seen that happen from you all coming out of the work that you're doing. That is, like you said, trying to get that buy-in, or just building community, building power. And so as you're talking, the statement that has never left me from my early work and connection with you, and some of the others at UCC, is people are capable of solving their own problems given the right conditions. And one of those conditions is being listened to, getting those resources that they already know that they need. And I've just really appreciated your storytelling around some of the ways that you're building powers, the values that go into how you do that too.
Mhm.
So thank you for sharing that. What are some of the moments where you felt most engaged in your work with UCC's educational justice work? Just a moment, a memory, a time. What was happening and what made that moment so powerful for you? It could be sharing about a current struggle. It could be something that you've seen as a victory, but just a moment in time, or moments if you have them, that kind of resonate right now in this moment where you felt really engaged and passionate about UC's educational justice work. And again, like what was happening? What made that moment so powerful for you, or those moments so powerful for you?
It's a good question, because I'm blessed that I feel like there are many, and it's hard to think about one. I think the big, like, direct actions when everybody turns out and gets mobilized, those ones always the shine. I want to situate my moment with students specifically. So some of our students planned and executed an action, a protest around teacher compensation. And you think of the complexity of a dynamic like this, right? Where you have a student body that's 80% people of color or students of color. You have a teaching force that's in Grand Rapids, I would say at least 90%, if not higher, white, right? There's an economic divide between those two, like a professional divide between those constituents. There's a lot of history issues with discipline in classrooms where students of color are disproportionately and stuff like that. So it's not an easy alliance to make. I say all
Yeah.
that to say, and yet our students, right? And these are students who come from pretty high performing schools, I will say, many of them, and they don't deal with the teacher shortage in the ways that their peers in lower performing high schools particularly are dealing with, right? They have the privilege of their educational experience feels secure in some ways. And yet they made this desire to say, you know what, in order for us to achieve this collective benefit for all of us, they do feel the teacher shortage a little bit, right? But in order for us to achieve this collective net benefit for all of our students, we actually have to put some stuff aside for now, right? It's tabled to say, nope, we need to stand in solidarity with the teacher union right now and be organizing and advocating for teacher compensation. It benefits us as students, right? And they had a whole narrative around why, but that narrative was really situated in like not their personal experience as like attending these higher performing high schools, right? But this sort of universal need for their peers. And so I think that really transformative thing for me in that process is these are students, these are young folks, their vote, their perspectives, their insight, all of that kind of stuff. These are folks that are often considered not worthy of inputting into systems. And yet they're able to consciously, I think, stand in solidarity with both their peers who could be looked down on, right? Like they tested into these higher schools. There's like all kinds of stuff. And also looking past some of the differences that exist with the teachers union to say, no, we actually have to actively build power with y'all in order for us to achieve what we want, right? And then we'll figure out the relational complexities of our stuff down the road, right?
Mm.
Like, so there was like a really beautiful model, I think, put in place by young folks
Yes.
who did these moves really naturally. It wasn't like, and part of me is y'all haven't been indoctrinated in the anti-racist
I was
stuff,
just
right?
about to
Yeah.
ask you about
So it's
that.
like, it's
Yes.
almost a different orientation into how you're immersed, what your origin story pushes you towards doing, which a lot of their origin story has been involved in this organizing work that we've been doing, right? So there's just I think a beauty in, and I think that the offering here is to say, if you're feeling stuck in this work where you're like, I'm trying to build my consciousness. I'm trying to like be a good ally, doing all this kind of stuff. Maybe there's another step that you need to take that's going to set you up to be involved in a project in a different kind of way and give you space to move and work and stand in active solidarity with in a different kind of way than what you've been primed to think is like how you go about doing it. So I would say that's probably been my biggest highlight is to give all the young people the shout out of, man, and this came really pretty naturally. There's a lot of work involved in coming up with these things. I don't want to downplay that, but the connections that were being made for folks were like, oh yeah, this seems right. So let's go talk to the teachers union kind of thing. I was like, damn, all right, let's
All
do
right,
it.
let's do it.
You know?
Let's do it. Let's do it. But no, as I was listening, I also caught that and like you said, yes, it's a lot that goes into it, but at the same time thinking about, oh yeah, how naturally it came to them. And then my immediate internal question was like, huh, I wonder what's the difference, what happened? And then shortly after, I'm thinking this to myself, and then shortly after, you're like, hey, y'all hadn't been indoctrinated in some of
You right.
the stuff, like y'all haven't
Yeah,
been told that certain things
yeah,
are impossible in the ways that some of the adults around us around you may have been. And so this is,
yeah.
I think, but there's something so powerful about that though, in that again, like you said, not diminishing any of the hard work, any of the conflict, the messiness that went into doing it, but mentioning that also this is them acting and seeing a very real need for their peers that they don't experience in the same way, but they're still having that value. And so there are questions around, all right, so again, what are some of the things that led them to see that value in that? Like, this isn't something that may impact me directly in these ways, but at the same time, I'm seeing a need for solidarity here, and we're going to act in, we're going to move towards that. And then also the way it was just like so natural. I know you said it, but it's just something so powerful about that, that I'm also hoping folks who are listening to this now will also catch that in a particular way too, that asks you to think about and ask yourself some questions, not only about your own origin stories, but then the folks that you are working with, particularly in working with young people. I also appreciate you elevating the fact that young folks are not often considered as their contributions are worthy in these decision making spaces. But as you're telling the story, but they did it so
Man,
seamlessly, so naturally. So like, why not? Yeah, let's go to the teachers union as you're describing that. There's just something so powerful about that to me as I listen to it. And I think within it, I think there's some messaging again that I'm hoping people reflect on. You're describing like, all right, so if you're feeling stuck, maybe there's some other ways that you can think about moving in different ways that, again, that might be different from the ways we've been primed to think. And so
Yeah.
a big part of this project is recognizing that we do have the capacity to think outside of those status quos we've been given.
How do we get them to get us what we want, even if they don't want to? So a lot of these students started organizing around school food and they realized, you know what? We don't have enough power on our own to make this case. So how do we build student power? Then there was like, all right, how do we go and talk to these other students in other schools? And as they did, realizing like, oh, yo, food is not the biggest issue in these schools. They don't even got teachers. Give
Yeah.
food, they don't even got
Yeah.
teachers. And so if we want to build power with these folks, we actually have to make sure that their needs are met. And so how do we do that then? We approach the teachers union and we're talking about teacher compensation now, right? And realizing that talking to the teachers union is also a power building activity. So these folks are still being driven by their own interests in terms of what they want to see happen. But the approach to it is much more collectivist and much less about, oh, if I just have the right information and I can make the case to a decision maker, which is, I think,
Yeah.
the normative way of how we think about change happening,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The harmonious way of change happening when it's, wow, man, we actually got to go out here and these alliances and whatnot may be messy and complicated as well. But we're out here doing this thing to build our power. And there's space for all of the interests at the table, right? Like we can create a society that serves the interests of everybody, that takes good care of everybody. Like it's possible. And we just have to do the work to figure that out.
You mentioned certain values that you hold as you do the work that inform how you go about doing the education justice work. What strengths or qualities have you developed through your educational justice work, and how have they helped you navigate challenges?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a good question. You didn't script this one in the format.
Nope. And like I said, there are a few, and some of them come up as follow-up questions too. I got another one actually that I want to ask you too. But if you can speak to this one, so you're talking about the organization. So we were talking about that for a little bit. This one's kind of in a way returning to just you as a person, like what's sort of informing your thing. What sort of things have you learned along the way or gained along the way in this work that helps you navigate challenges when it comes up? Just yourself and your own equity, leadership, or partnership with
Yeah.
other folks.
I've got one strength, which I would think more about as a skill, if you
Okay.
will. And then one quality, I think that's been an evolving kind of understanding for me. So I would say the strength is around facilitation, or the skill has been around facilitation. If you haven't had a chance, there's a wonderful book by Adrienne Murray Brown called Holding Change, and it's part of her emergent strategy kind of collection. But it's really a book for facilitators that talk about how do you hold the space for the conversations that we need to be having around social change, right? And I think that that's been a really critical skill for me to develop is like, how do you hold that space for folks, right? What do you have to let go of in the role of a facilitator? What do you have to welcome and cultivate for folks in that space? What are the things you need to account for, right? As it relates to power differentials or how people are situated or histories, right? Like all of that kind of stuff, I feel like has been, in order to be a good facilitator, you have to develop some emotional intelligence, read the room, right? Sense who's pulling back, who's stepping forward, who's leaning in, right? How do you solicit things from those that are maybe taking a back step? So there's lots of like ways in which you're consistently, and I'll say this, attending to the needs of the group, right? Which is a very different orientation for how we typically posture leadership, which is how does the group support the needs and desires of the leader, right? And so I would say that notion of quality of leadership for me has been the piece that's been consistently evolving over time. And I mentioned a little bit of my own personal history. I'm a straight, white facing, educated, middle class man. in the social justice space. And leadership requires you to be conscious and reflective of how you are situated in all of these spaces. But the role of a facilitator, I think, I think the role of a facilitator helps me in terms of my identity and how I'm postured to enter into a space in a way that doesn't allow all these other identity markers to drive the conversation for me. It positions me as as a learner and as a host more so than as an expert, which all of these other identity markers often push you towards. Um, I would say the emerging kind of big piece that I'm wrestling with right now is like, I do have ideas. I feel like I have a perspective, and all those kind of things. And how do you learn, take that with understanding
Yeah.
why? But there is a role for that, right? It's for strong leadership, for leaders in our movement spaces, in our collective movement spaces. And so I think that the journey that I'm on right now is trying to wrestle with that a little bit, right? So what does that mean? It doesn't just mean that a leader should always be a facilitator that decenters their voice. There's a space for active leadership in this. But how do you do that? What does it look like? Those are, I think, questions I'm grappling with now.
Speaking of your own perspectives, what practices do you think are important for building sustainable and inclusive social justice movements? And how can others utilize, adopt, incorporate these practices? As I'm thinking about everything you've shared around your work with supporting people in building power and the
Mm,
example you use with the students, like there's some things that they did, there's some things that you do that kind of helps that process
yeah,
run. As messy, as complicated, again, I love how you say that, and I'm gonna say it right there with you. It's not saying that everybody is always on the same page. There are some conversations
mm,
that are had, like, to the degrees that you all are getting closer to the goals that you're setting for yourselves and getting
mm,
closer to getting what you want, in spite of these systems not being designed to give you that, to give us that. What are some things that you found helpful in that messiness that kind of
right.
sustains you all and sustains your work? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a couple things. I would say personal practice or like my own orientation to it, and then practice within the work. I would say my personal practice, one of the things that's been the most life-giving to me has been reading. And I'm the type, like I'm the nerdy type. This might not be a thing. Could be just podcast format. It could be videos. There's great documentaries and stuff like that about things. I dogged on learning a little bit in the beginning, but what learning has enabled for me is it puts words, it gives me a vocabulary for things that I'm often struggling with or for ideas that I think, oh yeah, I love that somebody else is already been thinking about. And so having and or maybe the practice for yourself then is working to build your own language, right? And the thing I think I love about learning, and this is my nerd self, is like I'm the kind of person that keeps a log of like all the words that I read for the first time that I didn't know the meaning of, right? And I'm like, oh, I want to figure out, and I was always taught like figure out how to use it in a sentence, like, kind of thing. And so similarly with the learning piece, it's like, it's not just about the learning, but it's like, how do you situate that within the work that you're doing? And I think that's the disconnect that is often the case between this pedagogical emphasis on like building your consciousness versus doing the work, right? Like, I think those two things really, really need to go hand in hand. So if you're reading a ton, but you're not doing the stuff, right? Like if you don't have an applied idea of what this looks like, I encourage you to do that. Or if you're doing a lot of applied work, right? Sometimes we act out of these previous memories or the ways that we've been primed to do the work, like we talked about. And so sometimes broadening your reference library, as my friend Sammy Publius would say, is a really wonderful way to diversify your practice. So I would say that's been a really helpful thing for me. Yeah, I would say that the junction of learning and practice, right? That we shouldn't lose that. I think learning is also often very applied, if not more so applied than it is, cognitive in our sort of conscious brain.
Mhm.
Um, Practices as it relates to the work that has been really, really helpful for us. Um, it, I think having really clear goals is something that we miss in the movement oftentimes. Um, that right, we're in an age right now where um, we've been doing 10 years since BLM started. Black Lives Matter really kicked off in 2014 around Trayvon Martin's murder, right? But
Yeah.
we've been in 10 years, a decade now of mass mobilizations, mass protests, like mass stuff that has been really radicalizing for a lot of folks. But my local sort of critique of that here has been that we haven't had clear goals of what we want, what we're actually mobilizing around. Um, and I mean achievable, concrete step goals, right, that are going to move us in the direction and the spaces to have the necessarily dialogue to disagree about those and come to some kind of collective agreement in the same way I talked about with students and the teachers union and stuff like that, right? So it's like
Yeah.
these are not conversations where everybody's aligned necessarily, but they're conversations that we need to have. I'm not saying include like decision makers all the time in that, but I'm talking about from the movement
Yeah.
space, from the justice space, right? Like, how are we coming together, having the difficult conversations, creating some goals that we've agreed upon that we're going to move towards that are going to advance everybody's sort of collective agendas, right? So I think that's one piece that is really absent where we think about success as being around turnout, which is uh, as somebody who's trying to organize protests, like turnout is huge and it's really, really high. But without some of those other pieces, I do think we miss some things. And or we run the risk of our conversations around racial justice just being conversations and that's it, right?
Yeah.
They're not backed by any kind of teeth or power or plan to make a concrete difference in people's lives, which is absolutely necessary right now. People are hurting, and we need to do something about it. So I think, yeah, that's one thing I would offer for that, the sort of the practical applied spaces. Like, what are our goals? And then what are the necessary processes that we're utilizing that push us to collect on those and to figure out what those need to be.
Okay. Who or what has shaped your analysis and actions in your work?
Yeah. Ooh, there's a lot of books. I'll say, let me start with people and movements first, because I actually think those are more important. I'd say a movement that has been really inspirational to me that's national, but particularly I think our local arm of it has been Movimiento. They have a really strong set of goals that they've been moving towards. And I think that they practice some of the things that we talked about in terms of consensus-based decision making, right? Like you're actually existing and functioning in a group in ways I think that are countercultural to, or that not counter, that are countercultural, but perhaps model the vision of how things could be done in the
Mm.
future. And they've had staying power, right? They've been around locally in the same fight for 8 or so years at the very least locally. And that speaks to the ongoing kind of relationship building that they're doing within the community, right? So I think locally, Movimiento Cosecha in Grand Rapids has been a big inspiration to my work, not necessarily in terms of the wins, so to speak, although I think there have been, but more like the practice, the way that they go about doing it, the way that they hold to their values and practice them. Yeah, that's been a really beautiful example to me. I mentioned that Lee Patel article earlier, which I think is a really good one. The origins and pitfalls of racial justice. I think that always understanding where we come from is helpful, and they do a really good genealogy of even the term racial justice and where it comes from and what its origins were.
Mm.
Another book that's really helpful for me is Redistribution or Recognition, which is a conversation between two fantastic scholars, Nancy Fraser and blanking on the other guy's name. I'm trying to look it up right now.
Every
Fraser.
book,
Yeah.
every person, everything that you mentioned, I'm gonna put in the notes, and then
Oh,
this is also
sweet.
gonna go on the website too. So people who perhaps may even be being introduced to them as you're talking can go, and then now they've read that article too, and now we're 2, now we're 3, now we're 4, in terms of folks knowing.
Yeah. 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 So I think helpful books for me were Redistribution or Recognition, which is a conversation between Nancy Fraser and Alex Hannah, which is a little bit academic-y, but talks about this idea of, is it about recognition where we get our sort of public kind of acknowledgement, or is it about a redistribution of material wealth and power and stuff like that? And there's the spoiler alert, it's both, but I think that they do a beautiful job teasing some of that out. I also mentioned Adrienne Marie Brown, got a great book, Emergent Strategy, the Facilitator Companion, Holding Change, has also been really helpful for me. It's just like, how do we build our practice in terms of holding spaces for this kind of collectivist orientation a little bit more? Yeah. And so I would say those are some of my books that immediately come to mind on the subject. In terms of some individuals that have also really inspired me, yeah, I would say there's a lot of local folks who are trying to do the work. And that's often where a lot, just because these are folks that I have access to, that really inspire me in the work that they're trying to do or the work that they're trying to lift. So I would encourage listeners to say, don't worry about the individuals that I have in mind, but think about who are your local individuals that you might want to connect with or learn from, that might be doing things a different way or practicing something in a way that inspires you, and being able to tap in and sit at their feet a little bit.
Of the folks that you've mentioned, what might folks and then books and experience, what might you say in terms of, it could be appreciation, gratitude, just speaking to their impact on your and helping to shape your analysis in that?
Yeah, it's specifically my relational connection to Movimiento Cosecha is with somebody named Hema Lowe. I think Hema specifically models for me that kind of leadership that I'm still trying to figure out for myself. It's a facilitative leadership. It's an orientation towards people, but yet still being able to show up in a way that's you. If you met Hema, you definitely feel, oh yeah, you definitely like a leader kind of thing. And some of the typical normative understandings.
Yeah.
Like, I think Hema specifically for me has really, and this, she's again, one of my local heroes, is like somebody that I just really look to for, yeah, how do you be a leader in these kind of collectivist movement spaces in ways that feel authentic to yourself, to your gifts, to the community that you're engaged with, which is really obvious when you see her in relationship with the rest of her comrades in Movimiento Cosecha, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's a real respect, and not just respect for Hema, but vice versa, right? Hema's respect for her other organizers. So I think that she's been a great model for me around that question of what leadership can look like in this space. I would say, yeah, just continuing for us to wrestle with this idea of, um, are we doing what we need to do if we're not meaningfully transforming our social systems, right? And by that, hierarchies, power distributions, wealth, right? That to me is key. And I'll be frank, I'll give you my answer. I don't think we are
Yeah.
doing what we need to be doing if we're not doing those things. And so continuing to make sure that this kind of material emphasis is present in our work. And I think Nancy Fraser and Alex Connell, particularly Nancy Fraser, as she argues for the redistribution end of things, really pushes that and keeps that really centered in our visions for change, right? It's easy to get lost in the words sometimes or the promises. And unless our visions of change are observable by their felt difference in people's lives, they're not playing out how we need them to. So I think those continue to be my two forms of my, I think, accountability guides as we go about doing this work is, am I showing up as a leader in the way that I see others that inspire me are doing, right? And how am I interrogating that kind of role for myself? But also, how do we ensure that our projects stay committed to felt difference for the communities that I seek to be in relationship and in solidarity with?
I have 3 finish the statement prompts. I'll just finish the statement. I'll say the thing, and then whatever comes to your mind, it is just gonna
Yeah,
whatever
I
comes to
love
your
that.
mind. And then I'll ask a question about the next generation. I so appreciate you being here. Finish the statement. True social justice is possible when
People have the ability to say what they need and want for their own lives.
my approach to social justice is shaped by
More than the desires of just myself, but rather the community that I exist in relationship with.
understanding and sharing our social justice origin stories is important because
It shows us there's no one path to a common goal, right? We can all come together and do some stuff, but we might have to go back and relearn and rethink about some of the tests and things that we learned along the way. Yeah.
Yep, some of the things we learn along the way, some of the stuff we're carrying, we might have to rethink some of that. I'm hoping that these stories, the storytelling will be around for many years. To be quite honest, even beyond our time is my hope. And for future generations who might come across this recording, is there anything you'd like to pass to them? Is there anything you'd like them to know that you'd want to share with them?
Great grandbaby, I love you. Grandpappy loves you. That's it. No.
That's
uh,
real. Yeah.
I think what I would leave for folks is trust yourselves. Y'all are coming into a very different context than the one that we are in, just like we are in different contexts than those that came before us. And there's learning and wisdom there. Um, but you also have what it takes, and you have the ability to learn and discern and make the right decisions for what y'all got going on. And we're here for you. We got your back. But yeah, trust yourself and do what you got to do.
Kyle Lim. Thank you very much. Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Rolando.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Social Justice Origin Stories there or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch video episodes on YouTube at Social Justice Origin Stories, and I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe there as well. Video episodes are also available on the project website, socialjusticeoriginstories.com. Follow the project on Instagram at Social Justice Origin Stories. I'd love to hear about how you're engaging with the stories. Share your thoughts at socialjusticeoriginstories.com/contact or by emailing stories@socialjusticeoriginstories.com. To support the work of Social Justice Origin Stories, consider becoming a monthly patron. Your contributions will help keep this research going and support its mission. Visit patreon.com/socialjusticeoriginstories to learn more and to make a contribution. Again, that's patreon.com/Social Justice Origin Stories. You can start or stop anytime. Social Justice Origin Stories is edited, hosted, and produced by me, Relando Tompkins Jones. Many thanks to our storyteller this week and the many storytellers who have contributed to this project. And thank you for joining me this week. Take care.